Good afternoon, students of British and American culture. This lecture is coming to you almost 2 days late. There are several reasons for that, and so I will start with them. First of all, this is the textbook, and some people have tried to order it. I've had mine since September 1st, so I wasn't aware that some people were having trouble getting them delivered. So I contacted the publisher and the distributors, and supposedly there is stock. So I don't know what the delay is, but I've received several emails from students saying we're supposed to have a quiz next week, but I don't have the book yet. So I believe that you should have received a message, a text message, informing you that there is no quiz next Thursday. So that has been delayed 1 week, and we will do that quiz the following week instead, which is fine because we're supposed to have a Zoom lecture next Thursday anyway. Now, when it comes to the Zoom lecture, there is an issue too, because there are 54 students enrolled in this class. And it turns out that although the university has graciously purchased a very nice webcam for me, which is actually an upgrade from the one that I have. The resolution and the quality is excellent, but my computer and the other equipment I have can't handle it. And when I've already experimented with this, when I get 20 people on my screen, then it starts to lag and we end up having problems with communication and quality. So obviously 54 students in one Zoom meeting is out of the question because I don't have a budget for a new computer. My computer in my office from the university is like 7 or 8 years old, and my home computer is not much better. I will be getting a new computer, it looks like, but I can't afford to do that right now. So what we're going to do as a temporary fix, or maybe a fix for the whole semester, most likely, is, and this is for convenience sake too, because with 54 students, there is a limited amount of interaction I can do with each of you anyway. So we're just going to split the class in half. And there's going to be a group A and a group B. So the first 27 students on the attendance list will be in group A, and you will have your meeting at 10 o'clock next Thursday, and group B will have their meeting at 11. So we'll just have a 45-minute session for each group, and it'll be, the same content and the same lesson, just given back to back to different groups. So I will be sending both an email and a text message with the Zoom meeting that is relevant to you. The first 27 students will get one invite for 10 o'clock, and the remaining 27 students will get the invite for the second one, okay? So, some of this is experimental. The reason I didn't do a Zoom meeting with this class last semester is because there was over 70 students, and I was not as familiar with Zoom, so I didn't even attempt it. But we are going to attempt it, and I don't want to deal with so many students' questions through email this semester. So this is the opportunity we have for us to get to know each other a little bit, and for me to field questions and to give you instructions directly, instead of recording them and uploading them and then the feedback coming days later through email. So this should be interesting anyway, but that's the plan. You'll be getting the invite, and make sure you come at the correct time. I've already given you some notice, and the information is on the website. The Zoom link will be coming in the next couple days, and you should be there and attend that. And the way we're probably going to organize it is I'm basically going to mute the whole class because there's so many of you, and you can chat, you can type your questions or your inquiries or your comments, and I will respond to them in real time by speaking, and I will watch the chat window, and you can send me your messages rather than trying to control who's putting their hands up and who's getting to speak and who's not. I think if you send me text messages, and I respond to you in real time, that might work. So that's what we're going to try to do. We'll see how it goes. As for the textbook, as I said, I looked into it. The CNU Press and the distributors said it's not going to be a problem and that the books should be out. It's only supposed to take 1 day to get to you. So I don't really understand what's going on. If I phone them and say there's no problem and you say you're not getting a book, I don't really understand what is happening. So let's hope that this is resolved by early next week and it won't be an issue anymore. Certainly by the time we have class on Thursday, if it's still a problem, you can say, Professor, I still don't have my book. And then I'll go after people and find out what's going on. Okay, so for now, let's proceed. There is some stuff in the introduction that is we're going to skip over today because I want to talk about it in the real-time lecture on Thursday. Like I said, today I want to talk about basically the first 1,000 years from 0 AD to 1000 AD until the Norman conquest. So we're talking about basically from the Roman invasion to the Norman invasion. So the reason for that is because a lot of the stuff we know about the British Isles that is recorded comes from this period. The people called the Celtic people who lived there before the Romans basically used oral history. So there wasn't really a written history for us to follow. So suddenly, you know, the British Isles sort of appear in the record books. And this is sort of what happens to many cultures in the Roman Empire, is that they're really unknown and they're not talked about or written about. And then as the Romans discover them, they become, you know, recorded and recognized, and we get more information. Obviously it's from the Roman perspective, but we have more information, and we don't just have things that we're digging up out of the ground and you know, leftover items that are buried and things like that archaeologists find. So today is going to be a little bit more like a history lesson, because it is going to go sort of from 0 AD forward 1,000 years, and everything happens in order as a history class would normally be taught. And the other details about British identity and about how to study culture and how to analyze things that are on the website, and they are in week 2. Don't worry about that. That stuff is going to be covered next week in the Zoom lecture. I'm going to discuss it because I think it's easier for me to talk about it in real time and explain it, and you to ask questions as I go, and for me to give examples as you're interacting with me. For this though, basically I'm just going to lay out the information for you to make notes, and I want you to remember it, because essentially this 1,000 years and these 5 cultures, these 5 different cultures from different parts of Europe, they have their periods of dominance, and how they interact with each other and how they overlap and how they influence each other really produces the foundation of what British culture is. And that's why we're talking about this. This is why I begin the class right back here, and I don't begin the class 10,000 years from before today, but 2,000 years before today, because this is the point where the first dominant culture that we know of in the British Isles becomes affected by an invading culture, or a colonizing, and a merger with a new culture, and it becomes a subculture that is dominated by another one. So let's begin the story. We do count, I know there's different, we say common era, and there's different ways of counting the dates now, but I grew up just saying AD. So we're just going to go with the old-fashioned, you know, Jesus was born somewhere around 0 AD, and Western people count the years from his birth approximately. And I know there's lots of issues with that way of using the calendar, but that's what we're going to do, because that's what the British did, and that's what the Americans insist on doing still. So before 0 AD, about 50 years before, there was a very famous man named Julius Caesar. And Julius Caesar, we won't get into him, although he's one of my favorite historical people. He was a fascinating person in many aspects. But suffice to say, he was like a Napoleon type person, an Alexander the Great. He was a military genius. He was a political figure. He was clever and influential and famous, and that's why we know about him today. Essentially, the way that he gained power in Rome was by his military conquests and by writing back to Rome about his achievements. So what he did was he took legions from the Roman. It was the Roman Republic, not the Empire. He took the Roman legions out of Italy, and he attacked what is now France. And he fought them over in many campaigns, and he defeated and conquered most of the area of what is now France, and a gigantic territory with millions of people. And the people that lived there were called the Gauls. Okay, now you don't need to know all this stuff for the course, but it's essential background knowledge. Now we'll just finish talking about Caesar by saying, once he had done that, he had sort of gone to the edge of what the Romans knew existed. And when he looked across the water, he saw there was another land there. There was a gigantic island about 26 miles, about 40 kilometers away, that you could see on a clear day. And it was also inhabited by tribes of people that were culturally related to the Gauls, where France was. So where Belgium and the Netherlands and France are today, there were these Celtic tribes, which they, being culturally related and economically tied to the people that lived in the British Isles, they were actually helping each other. So Julius Caesar had a problem with the whole group of people, because when he fought any one of them, they supported each other, and sometimes they made armies by drawing in soldiers from each other's tribes. So after defeating the Gauls, he looked across and he saw this island called a long time ago, it was called Albion. That's the ancient name for England or the British Isles. And he decided that he was going to be the first Roman to go and explore or conquer this island. So basically, you can imagine it as almost like Julius Caesar is sort of like a Neil Armstrong or something. Nobody's ever been to the moon before, and Armstrong's the first person to step on the moon. And forever after that, even though there's lots of other astronauts who are just as good as Armstrong, it doesn't matter because he was the first one on the moon. Julius Caesar wrote a diary, and he wrote it back to Rome about all the things he was seeing and all the sights, the mountains, and all the animals, the creatures, the tribes, the people, and money and slaves and new finished goods were being funneled back to Rome. So he decided to do this expedition and go to the British Isles. And when he got there, he fought some people. He had some trouble with his ships, as people normally do when they cross that channel. It's sometimes not very friendly. And he wrote back that he had been the first Roman to fight and visit the British Isles, which would later be called by the Romans Britannia. So he didn't really occupy it or remain there. He went back to Rome, and then other things happened to Rome which transformed into a Roman Empire after Julius Caesar's death. So that was the contact that the Celtic people experienced first from the Romans. Was about minus 50 years, basically before our class actually kind of starts, right? So what are these people like? Well, the Romans are probably fairly familiar to you. The Romans looked at all of these people just like the Greeks did. They looked at all the people who were not in their society and in their civilization as barbarians. So it wouldn't really have mattered what they were like, whether they were Persian or African or German or Briton or Celtic. Basically, the Romans looked down on any civilization that wasn't theirs. So a typical Roman person would have been shaven, and would have worn a toga. And if he was a soldier, he would have worn his armor and had a helmet with perhaps a brush on the top of it. If he was a centurion, and have his spear and his sword at his side and a shield. And they prided themselves on looking clean cut, and the organization and the manners of a Roman citizen were very important. They followed the laws, they followed the rules, and they had an organized religion with a religious leader, and they had temples and cities and roads and all of the things that Rome has. The Celts did not. The Celts they certainly had big towns and villages, almost what you would call, I suppose, a city by population, but it wasn't built like a city. It had large buildings where people gathered, and there was communal farming, and there were roads, certainly, but the structures were mostly made of wood. There was mixtures of wood and stone. They didn't have a centralized religion, and they didn't have a centralized bureaucracy. They traded using goods, animals, and people as representatives of money, and they didn't have a currency, and they didn't have organization. They had kings and chiefs of different tribes. They didn't have a senate or a republic or an elected leader of the entire country. They didn't have courthouses or laws or anything like that. Nonetheless, they did have organizations, and they did have beliefs. They had their own language. And they did trade, and they did have ships. They had technology. They had metal weapons, but the way that they fought and the way that they dressed and the way they behaved was completely different. I'll just give you some small examples. When they fought, the Celtic people often used their weapons and fought with their upper body naked, even if it was cold. They would have pierced parts of their body and put markings on their body to make themselves more intimidating. They often had long beards and long hair and would tie them up. When they fought, the Romans always fought in neat, organized squares and lines, with their equipment behind them and their families at home in the city. But when Celtic and German and Britain warriors fought, often their whole families would be behind the army with them, encouraging them and pushing them to fight. So one reason that they fought with so much ferocity was the fact that they couldn't run away because their families were right behind them in a cart. And if they ran away, maybe their families were going to get killed, or even in some cases, their families might refuse to let them run away and say, get back in the battle and fight. So they were it was a very different way of fighting, the Celts and the Romans, because the Romans, everything about Roman society was about rules, organization, and logic, and obedience and discipline. And the Celtic culture was more about, tough physical toughness and respect and individuality and equality in some sense. There wasn't like a sort of, the king himself wasn't this person that lived in a gigantic palace that had millions wasn't filled with, didn't have buildings and servants and all this rich wealth the way that an emperor or a king would in any other civilization. The king was just a very well respected. He might have some better weapons and a bigger house, but he wouldn't have a gigantic castle full of many women and servants and the best food and that kind of thing. The society was really, in some ways, based more on equality and on communal living than the Roman society was. Roman society was very hierarchical. So there was the Senate and the consul and the rich at the top, and then it was a pyramid all the way down to this mass group of poor slaves and citizens with very little money at the bottom. But the rural lifestyle of the Celts was really depended a lot more on the individual and the household and the village to work together. So a totally different perspective on how the culture works, right? In battle, this was very obvious because in battle, the Romans would fight together in unison and do exactly what they were told. They would follow orders, and they would not retreat or run unless told to do so. And when they fought against the Celts, even though they were, in some ways, the Celtic people were taller, stronger, had better diets, were more muscular, individually maybe better warriors, they never could defeat a real Roman army on an even battlefield, even if they had more people, because they just fought as individuals. Sometimes they even chained the Celts. Sometimes even chained their arms or their shields to each other so that individuals wouldn't run away when the battle started, in order to keep everybody together so that they could fight more effectively. But this individual brave, exhibition of power and strength didn't work. And that's one of the reasons why the Romans took over the entire Celtic world, except for Ireland and Scotland. So these are the major differences. A Celtic warrior was interested in fighting one-on-one with another soldier. If they went into battle, they focused on the Roman soldier and trying to kill that individual. The Roman army was looking to defeat the entire group of Celtic warriors, which they did over and over again. So in the first century, approximately 100 years, a little bit less than 100 years after Julius Caesar explored a little bit of the south corner of England, the Romans invaded in force. And when they came, they basically used some Celtic tribes as allies, and they fought against other ones. And the Celtic tribes in the British Isles never unified. So basically, it was a divide and conquer situation where the Romans took over very quickly. So you ended up with the Celts, with all the things that I mentioned already about their communal lifestyle, their village life, raising and trading and using language, and not really having an urban lifestyle, occupying all of the British Isles, and then the Romans coming in and transforming everything. So let's talk about what the Romans did. Once they came in and they either subdued or conquered all of the Celts, we'll start calling them Britons very soon, okay? It's Celtic culture, but once the Romans get there, we're going to start calling these people Britons, okay? Notice this is where the British word comes from. The word Great Britain comes from the Roman word Britannia. So we're going to start calling the Celts. They're the same people genetically, but culturally, they're changing into these people called the Britons. Okay? And once they change into the Britons, they start to become more like Romans. The Romans build all these roads, and they have these big armies with soldiers, and they live in barracks, which is like a soldier's dormitory. And they start building these forts and roads and walls and aqueducts and cities and baths, and colosseums and racetracks for entertainment and markets for selling goods. And then the ships start coming in, bringing things from other parts of the empire, and you end up having a completely different culture, a Roman culture. And so we call this culture that evolved out of an upper class, an organizing, dominating power, but with a Celtic origin. We call it the Romano-Briton people. Okay, so we'll say 95% of the people are still Celtic, but they don't have tattoos. Well, most of them don't. They give up a lot of that stuff. They start dressing like Romans, talking like Romans, behaving like Romans, and cutting their hair and shaving their faces and imitating Roman style stuff. And their art starts to imitate, Roman everything. So this is what it means to be Romanized. All the things that I just mentioned between those two cultures. First, Celtic culture is all over the place, all over France too. It kind of gets transformed gradually, but many of those people are enslaved. So there's not really a choice. All the people, they're under the Roman boot, as we call it. The Romans take over, and they force them to change the way their lifestyle is. So it is in many cases a very violent and shocking transition into this Roman period. But the Roman period in France lasts a lot longer than it does in England. But in England, it lasts, in Britannia, it's almost 400 years long. So it leaves a very, very distinct imprint on the geography and the culture, especially the geography and the demographics of England, because it is the Romans that build London because it's in a perfect. Romans are very good at choosing places to establish cities. Istanbul is originally a Roman city. Paris was established as a Roman city. London, Londinium, was originally chosen by Roman city planners to build the capital of Britannia, the capital of the island. And it was obviously an excellent choice, because that eventually became the largest city in the world, the capital of England and the capital of the British Empire. So that's all. The Romans had a profound influence. They built these roads and they chose these places for cities and forts and bathhouses and bridges, and those places are still used. They're still so well planned, so well built and organized that in London you can go and you can see the stones are still there, and the people still travel the same path that the Romano-Britons did. So they had a profound influence. So you start with the Celts. The Romans come in and they transform the whole place. But as you know, the Roman Empire doesn't exist anymore. It fell a long time ago. So around 400 AD, the Romans withdrew their soldiers, their legions, because Italy was unstable and they needed the money and the equipment and the soldiers and the government, the leaders back in Rome. So they withdrew all of the things that kept Britannia secure and just kind of abandoned it there, with all the Romano-Britons, without any soldiers or governors or funding from the Roman Empire to keep them safe. So suddenly it was just like they were abandoned. So the Romano-Britons were vulnerable to any outside, interested group of people. So the people from the north, the Picts and the Scots and the Irish, everybody started sort of invading and picking at the places that really were not protected by anybody properly. The groups that were most successful at invading Britannia turned out to be the people that came from Germany. These are the Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes. Now, I'm trying to keep this lecture at a reasonable length, so I'll go quickly through what happens without any, anecdotes about Julius Caesar. The Angles and the Saxons are the larger groups. They came over, and through a combination of fighting and sort of occupation, they pushed the former Romano-Briton, but we'll just call them Britons now. They pushed the Britons west, or they intermarried with them and mixed with them. But basically, the Britons started to be pushed westward, and so they were unable to defend themselves, and they kept giving up ground, and they ended up sort of in the west end of the island in a place which is now called Wales, and the southwest where Cornwall is, where the Cornish people live, and those places still have connections to the Celtic ancestry of the Britons, okay? But we'll talk about that later. These Angles and Saxons and Jutes, but the Jutes are kind of a minor player, so we always include them in the list, but what we call the group of people that will become the English, we call that ethnicity Anglo-Saxon, so the Jutes get ignored. They create 7 kingdoms. these Angles and Saxons, and one kingdom formed by the Jutes. And these 7 kingdoms get established, and England is not unified. There's Wales in the west, there's Cornwall in the southwest, and then there's these 7 Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. And this is the beginning of the nation of England once these kingdoms start merging and they start sharing the same language. The Germanic language that is the basis for English is the language that the Anglo-Saxons used. Now, you wouldn't recognize it, of course, because this is not even Old English. It's like the language that came before Old English. But what they're speaking in the words, the basic sounds and structures that they use will evolve into Old English, and Old English will evolve into Middle English, and that will in turn become Early Modern English, and Shakespeare will use that, and then we'll eventually end up with what we're using now, Canadian English or whatever it is. Okay? So it is the Anglo-Saxons, their primary contribution is they take over the whole island, they split it into 7 different kingdoms, they're from Germany, they give their name to the ethnic group. I am Anglo-Saxon because my ancestors came from England for the most part. I'm mixed with some other people too, but that's what we call it, Anglo-Saxon, okay? And the language, the English language, and of course, the name of the former country, but now the part of the United Kingdom, England, was also named by them Angeland. Angeland became, from the Angles, the land of the Angles became England. So you got Britannia from the Romans, and England from the Angles, and the Saxons, Anglo-Saxon from those 2 Germanic people. Okay? Now, the 7 kingdoms split up weaker separately than they could be if they were together. There were these people that lived in Denmark and Norway and Sweden, which we refer to as the Vikings. But and I will call them Vikings too because it's easier. But at the time there was no such thing as Denmark. That the kingdoms hadn't really developed yet. They were forming these kingdoms, but basically they're just these people that the French called the Norse, the Northmen, the people from the northern areas. So there's all these groups of people, and at first they're just raiders. They're just small groups of people, but the groups become bigger and bigger. And England and Scotland are right there. They're right on the way to France or Spain or anywhere else. So it's like first stop, attack the east coast or west coast of any coast, of southern coast of England. It doesn't really matter. Basically, these 7 Anglo-Saxon kingdoms were constantly being attacked by the Vikings. And the Vikings were no one was able to stop them effectively, so they started taking chunks out of the island and starting to make their own villages and settling there. They made an attempt to conquer the entire island at one point, but they were unable to do that because of a certain king. His name is King Alfred, and he was able to stop them before they conquered all of the kingdoms. And when he did that, he started to roll back the Viking invasion and restore the unity of the Anglo-Saxon kingdom. And that's when these kingdoms started to merge and create something that was like England. The Viking attack sort of forced these separate kingdoms to combine their strength in order to fight against the Vikings. So the Vikings, they have a very important contribution to British culture as well. It's because they sort of forced the creation of a unified kingdom, which would eventually sort of transform into England, a nation state. Some people consider it the first nation state. And the threat of the Vikings had a lot to do with that. The whole northern part of the island, even northern England and Scotland, was basically covered in Vikings and under Viking control for a couple hundred years. So, the English were really, the Romano former Britons were in the west, the Anglo-Saxons were in the south, and the Vikings had control of most of England for a period of time. So you've got, in 0 AD, you've got the Celtic culture, and then In the first century, the Romans come over and they take over, and there's a Romano-Briton culture for the first 400 years. Then the Roman culture withdraws along with the power and the military and the political control of the Romans in 400 AD. And then around 600 AD, you get all of this immigration and invasion of Germanic groups from northern Germany, primarily the Angles and Saxons. So you end up with these Anglo-Saxon kingdoms from 600 to about 1000 AD. But around 800 AD until 1000 AD, you constantly have this Viking presence, especially in the north of England, which causes Anglo-Saxon culture to change again. In one sense, in response to the threat of the Vikings, they start to combine into larger groups until it's essentially an English kingdom instead of a group of 7 kingdoms. But also the Vikings being there, they start to mix with Viking words start entering the language. They trade with the continent more because the Vikings are experts at sailing. So there's a lot of interaction between the Viking countries, Scandinavia, Northern Europe, and England. There's a lot of, so for the period of 800 AD until 1000 AD, England is more closely connected to Denmark and to Sweden and to Northern Europe than it is to anywhere else. That's its strongest connection because of the war, because of the battles and the raiding, but because of the trading and because of the people moving back and forth. And you can see this in the really early English literature, the most famous story of which is Beowulf. And Beowulf, that story, or Havelock the Dane is another one. Those stories are all oriented around Danish culture and about heroism, the same kind of stuff that you would imagine Odin and Thor would be involved in these stories. They're fighting monsters and beasts, and they're sailing, and it's about honor and sacrifice and the end of the world and all those kind of values of heroism that the Vikings had. And this culture was very, very influential in England and in Scotland, in the British culture of that time. It's not a British culture yet, I should say. It's influential in the people that live in the British Isles as this idea of a British culture starts to take root. So the Vikings really, they affected Ireland, Scotland, Wales, England. They raided everywhere, they traded everywhere, and many of them immigrated and made their own towns and intermarried with the Angles, the Saxons, the Welsh, the Cornish, the Scots, and the Irish. So, you know, that's what British really ends up being, is a mixture of all these people. But we still haven't added one more of the important groups that really has probably, other than the Romans, the greatest impact. But we don't have time to talk about them today. So this brings us up to about 1000 AD. And around 1000 AD, there is a king of England called King Canute, and he's called King Canute the Great. And he is the king of England. He's the king of the British Isles and Denmark and parts of Sweden at the same time. So right around 1000 AD, actually, England is unified with the Viking countries briefly. So, and that's called the North Sea Empire. So you can see how England at 1000 AD was quite different than we think about it today, because it was really, you know, a part German, part Viking, part Celtic country, right? But in next week's Zoom lecture, we're going to talk about the Normans. And the Normans have their connection with the Vikings too. But after the Normans arrive in England and William the Conqueror defeats the Anglo-Saxon king, what's really going to happen is English culture is going to pivot towards France, towards the south. And from that point on, I would argue, for the last 1,000 years, that's why the Norman invasion in 1066 is the most important date in any English history course. And everybody knows the name William the Conqueror, because from that day, from that year, there is a book actually called 1066, The Year That Changed Everything. From that point onward, England's cultural focus is towards Europe, the continent. It already had connections to Italy through religion, which we'll talk about that a little bit later. But this is a political, military, and cultural connection that really never goes away. And it didn't exist before that. Even in the Roman period, there wasn't such a strong connection between the continent and England. So we're going to talk about the Normans. That'll be the final group of the 5. For the quiz, this is important. Some students just end up memorizing. Okay, I've seen this on the test before. They go C R A N D N. I can't even get it right because I don't even care about the letters. But they just put the first letter, C R A D N, and then you got your Celts, Romans, Anglo-Saxons, Danes, Normans. That'll only get you 1 or 2 points on the quiz, because what I'm really interested in is what each of those groups contributes to what becomes British culture, because that's what the name of the course is, right? The name of the course is not memorize who invaded who in what order. The most important thing is the cultural effect. What was Celtic culture like? And then how did the Romans come in and change it? And then in their turn, how did the Anglo-Saxons reorganize England and how they lived during that period? And then how did the Vikings change how they lived after that? And then finally, when we talk next week, we will discuss what the Norman effect was, which was very profound and will require a lecture unto itself. I stuck all of these 4 in together to try and condense it, but that can't be done with the Normans. Okay, so next on the list is the Normans, and we're going to talk about also the famous kings that had roles. Some of them are mixed into these cultures too. So that is it. This is a late delivery for the lecture. I apologize for that, but there was some house cleaning and some confusion about the textbook, so that's the reason for that. Next week, we will have a Zoom lecture on Thursday, and we'll discuss the Normans, and then we'll be back to doing the regular recording schedule for a few weeks, and we'll stick some quizzes in there once these books are delivered. Thank you very much for listening. That was a little bit longer than I intended, but I hope you stayed with me until the end, and make sure you remember this stuff and make your notes, because I promise you it's going to be on the quiz and on the midterm as well. Thank you for listening, and have a great day.